Hey everyone, it's Denise Brown from the Caregiving Years Training Academy. Welcome to our Caregiving Book Club. We connect with authors of caregiving books, talk about their writing process, and talk about why they picked a caregiving genre to write about. So I'm thrilled and delighted to welcome Katie Powner. Hi Katie, how are you?
Hi, good. How are you?
Good. So your second book came out in October 2021, and it's called A Flicker of Light.
Yes.
And it's actually based on a story that your grandmother used to tell you. As you sat and looked at the mountains, you would see a flicker of light. And she told you what that flicker is. And what was the story she told you?
Yeah, when the sun would start to get low, it would reflect off the window of an old cabin up in the Cascade Mountains. And when that light would appear, she would say, "Look, there's Miner McGee turning on his headlamp so that he could search for treasure." And of course, as kids, we just ate that up and we thought, oh, he's up there searching for treasure. And she would, elaborate. And sometimes the story would change, but she always went back to kind of the main story was that this miner McGee, was just always searching for treasure. And so in A Flicker of Light, I used that legend in the story.
First of all, I love that she named him Miner McGee.
Yeah.
My Irish mother would appreciate that very much. So when did you know that story, which sounds like it just really enchanted you when you were growing up,
Right.
when did that story become, okay, I know I have a novel?
That's a great question because I actually tried to write that story not as a novel a bunch of times. I tried to write it as a short story. I tried to write it as a blog because I just wanted to share. It was just kind of a special little story to me and it connected me to my grandma. And so I just wanted to share that. And so I never really thought of it as a novel until my grandma had passed away from Alzheimer's, and it had been a couple of years, and I was starting my writing career, which made me think of her a lot because she was the original storyteller in my life, and she always really encouraged my writing and my creativity. And so that's when I started to kind of put those two things together, that there could be a story about the legend and about my grandma, and that I could put them together. And that's when it started to become a novel.
So how did you put it together?
Well, in the book, there's a grandma, and she tells this same story to her granddaughter in a fictional family, but it's the same story and it's the same kind of relationship between the grandma and the granddaughter. And then in the book, a lot of other things happen. The story is not about the legend, but the legend is just something that connects the two of them, the grandma and the granddaughter. And that is just kind of it demonstrates sort of how their relationship changes.
I'm always curious how long it actually takes then to write the book. So you had been fiddling with it, for lack of a better word, and then you finally figured out, okay, this is the form it needs to take. Once you had that, how long did it take you to write it?
It took about 6 months to get a complete first draft that was, a decent, complete draft. And then from there, I had a couple people read it, some early readers who were able to give me some feedback. And so I could do some revising, do some changes before I turned it into my actual editor. So there was probably about 8 to 10 months of actual working on it before it went to the publisher.
Okay, so let's step back for a moment. You have a publisher, which I'm assuming means you have a book deal.
Right.
So this is your second book.
Uh-huh.
Did you publish both books through the same publisher?
Yes. Yep. Bethany House. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when you had the second book in your head, this is the form. Did you pitch it then to your editor at the publisher? And then what was that like?
Yes, I did. I had basically what we call a blurb. So the blurb would be kind of like what you would see on the back of a book, the little short synopsis. So I had the blurb, and I had the first couple chapters basically is all I had. And I pitched that to my editor. And the first time that I pitched it, he basically said, it's not time yet. We can't look at this book yet because your first book has not had enough time to prove itself yet, basically. So they were wanting to see what happened with that first book before they were willing to give me a chance on a second one. And so I had to keep writing the book, not knowing whether or not they wanted it. I basically on faith said, I'm going to finish it anyway, even though he didn't, I was hoping he would say, yeah, it's great. Finish it. We want it. He didn't do that, but I decided to finish it anyways, to go for it in the hopes that eventually he would take another look at it. And pretty much right as I was finishing up that first draft, he circled back to it. We brought it back up and that time he wanted it. So
in our book club, we've had conversations with authors who have self-published and who've had a publishing deal.
yeah.
There's pros and cons to both.
Right.
Yes. So how did you know? Well, I guess when you have a book deal, you say yes. I'm wondering if you had ever considered self-publishing, or if you went right to, you know what, I need a book deal in order to make this happen.
Right. It actually, for me, was a pretty easy decision because in the stage of life that I'm at, I have a bunch of kids and they're still at home. And that means that my attention is so divided right now at this stage in my life that I knew I couldn't do the self-publishing, which requires a lot of extra work on my end with the marketing and a lot of things that you're doing on your own. And so I think self-publishing is great. I just knew that I didn't have the space in my life for it, basically. So I knew that at this point in my life, I needed a traditional deal in order to make this work.
Okay. And how did you make that deal happen?
Well, that took quite a few years. The first book that I got published was actually the fifth book that I wrote. So there were 4 books prior to that I had completed, that I had pitched and submitted around and been rejected. And they had all, been squashed and put away. And then you start a new one. And so I had done that for several years, gone to conferences, met editors, submitted to them, been rejected, repeat for several years until it clicked.
Yeah, I think we all think it just happens like that.
Yeah.
And it's so important to know that it happens because of tenacity.
Right. You have to keep going because that first book is probably going to get rejected. And so then you can just cling to that book and just keep moping with it for years and years, hoping something will happen. Or you can set it aside, start over, do it again. Yep.
So you had your first book published through your publisher,
Mm-hmm.
and it's The Sewing Season. And that
Uh-huh.
was the book that they said, okay, we're going to see how you do.
Yep.
What did you learn about your writing process between that book and then A Flicker of Light?
Well, it's interesting because, like I said, I had already finished 4 other novels before that. So I felt like I already had a pretty good routine of every year in October and November, I would outline and begin a new story. And I had done that then for several years in a row. And I had kind of a process, and I had been sticking to that because I had told myself, if I do get a deal, I want to be able to say, this is how long it takes me to write a book. This is when I can turn it in. And I know that because I've done it several times. And so because of that, I was able to, I knew exactly what to expect. I knew what to expect of myself and what I was capable of. And that ended up being a huge blessing that I had the foresight to plan that into my life ahead of time, rather than all of a sudden, now I have a contract, now I have to plan it in, and how, now it's like too late. So I would say, as far as what I learned, I feel like I kind of already had learned a lot about the process and the writing. Mostly what changed was looking at the story through the eyes more of my editor as I was working on it, because before I only looked at it through my own perspective. But now I had this other person who was kind of always felt like over my shoulder. So I kind of would look at the story a little bit differently through their eyes.
So what I love what you just shared with us was you were always positioning yourself for success.
That was my plan, honestly. Yeah, I knew what I wanted and I knew what I had to do to get there.
It's interesting that you talk about an editor over your shoulder. I worked in trade publishing 30 years ago, and I had an editor at a trade magazine that I worked for. His name is Ed Lee, and I always have Ed over my shoulder with my sentence structure, with how I begin a sentence, how I end a sentence. It's really interesting how that editor gets in your head,
Right.
which
Yeah.
I have felt made me a better writer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that it saved me time also. If it's just me, if my editor's not on my shoulder, I tend to maybe waste some time kind of rabbit trailing or, experimenting almost. But when he's in my ear and I'm hearing what he's going to be saying when I know he reads it later, and I know he's going to say, cut that. And I know he's going to say, this is superfluous. So then I don't waste time on it as I'm going because I already know that. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And I always feel like I have a much more focused appreciation for a sentence.
Yeah.
And I'm really looking for a tight sentence.
Right. Yeah. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So when did you know you were a writer?
I have always been a writer. I mean, it's all I've ever wanted to be. And like I said, my grandma really encouraged that. She always kind of told stories and made up little stories. And her and I would together come up with funny, like poems and songs when we would go camping and things like that. And so it's something I always wanted to do. I didn't think I would probably get to do it until my kids were grown and out of the house, because I didn't think I'd be able to give the time to it that it needed. But the Lord had other plans for me, I guess. And he brought that into my life a little sooner than I expected, but I did expect it.
Yes. So let's talk about how you actually structure your day so you write. So you have a busy life. You have people who are counting on you, little people,
Yep.
a spouse. So how do you structure your day?
Right. Well, right now I have 4 kids at home. We're a foster family. So sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less, but right now there's 4. And the youngest is 7 months and the oldest is 15 years old. So there's a big range of different types of needs and different schedules and stuff going on. And so usually I have to know when the nap time is going to be. Nap time is the key work time. So when the baby is napping, I structure my day around when is he going to be sleeping. And so I get all the other things where I'm flitting around. I get all that done while he's up, roaming around, making noise, needing diaper changes. So that when he lays down, I can drop everything else and sit and work, for that 2-hour window. And sometimes, that's all I have in a day.
So a lot of our listeners will be in a situation where they might be caring for a family member,
Right.
chronic illness, or in the midst of a disease process. And so
Mhm.
they're looking for that window. And what
Right.
I have found is that I have a harder time pivoting from caregiving to writing. And I do much better if I write in the morning before caregiving starts. And I think it's interesting that you're able to make that pivot. What is it that you do so you can make that pivot?
That is interesting that you say that. I was just thinking about this the other day, because one of the keys to my success is that I can pick it up in a snap, for that brief window of time. Because if I don't, if it takes me an hour to get into it, I've just, wasted very precious time. And so I think everyone needs to find what works for them. And I've just always been very busy person. Have a lot of energy, very ambitious. And so, excuse me, excuse me. And so I think it's always, I just have it right on the edge of my brain and my thoughts. And even when I'm doing my housework, making dinner or whatever, I'm still thinking about the story, so that, at the drop of a hat, I can pick that up. Even if maybe I only have this 30 minutes, I want to be able to use it. So I always have it right there, just in case I'm going to sit down, I can write a couple paragraphs and then I have to go pick up the kids from soccer practice. Even if that's all I have, you can build a book on that.
So you're always evolving the story in your head.
Yes.
So that when you have time, you know what the next evolution of the story is. And that's
Right.
what you focus on.
Right.
And it sounds like it helps because you've spent so much time planning the book out in the fall.
Yes, that I think is a key for me. Like I said, it's different for everyone because everyone's schedules are different and everyone's creativity is different. But I spend a lot of time kind of mapping out the outline and, and just spending time with the characters so I know who they are and what they're going to do. And so that then on the other end of it, I'm ready. Yeah.
There's a show that I love to watch, which is called Schitt's Creek. So
Okay. Yeah. I've seen it. Yeah.
yeah, so when the father and the son, Dan Levy and his father, I can't remember what his first name is, so I'll call him Mr. So Mr. Levy and his son Dan decided to have this TV show. And they talked about how much time they spent on character development. They really created characters that became these living beings,
Right.
which helped them when they wrote the actual episodes, when they wrote the stories.
Right.
It made it easier. So it sounds like you do something similar, a lot of character development.
Right. I like to, I mean, and the characters, you'll discover things that you didn't expect as you go. I mean, there's no way around that. You can't know everything about a character until you start telling their story. But I do like to spend a lot of time with them so that I know what they would say, what they would find funny, and then I can easily say like, oh, they wouldn't do that. That makes no sense. They wouldn't do that. So then I can move on and do, rather than wasting time on that. And then down the road, realizing, oh, that doesn't fit with their character. Well, then I've just wasted a bunch of time that I don't have. So I can know right away, hey, they wouldn't do that. That makes no sense. Let's throw that out. Let's try again.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about promoting your book, A Flicker of Light. So what's it like to get out there and talk about something that is so close to your heart that you really have put so much of who you are into, and then go out in the world and say, okay, everybody, let me know what you think.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's nerve-wracking for sure. I like to try to just focus on the lessons in the story, what the heart of the story is, rather than on like myself or on the book's success, or even on did you like it or not, do you like this, but more on just like, for example, in A Flicker of Light, this whole idea of caregiving. There's a lot of people who have loved ones with dementia or other things that they are carrying that burden. And so I like to focus on that, on bringing hope to them, on saying, I see you, I see what you're doing, and I've been there, and focus on that kind of thing rather than on like, buy my book.
Right. Yes, that's a lot of pressure. Buy my book.
Right. I mean, by the time I've written it and it's out there in the world, I've done what I can do. I've done everything I can do. So at that point, it's in the Lord's hands. And I don't want to say I don't care, but I kind of don't care. I'm like, I've done my part. And now I just want to, to connect with people.
There you go. I love that. That's such a great reminder that it's really an opportunity to connect, and you don't necessarily have to worry about the reviews, because
Right.
the connecting makes it a success.
Right. Exactly.
So someone on Twitter tweeted a few months ago something that I've always remembered, and that is, when you write your book, people will love it and some people will hate it. Still write your book.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that it's a good thing when I see reviews coming up that are like, I didn't like this book. I don't know what they were trying to do or whatever. I think that's a good thing, because that means that my book is getting out to people past my circle of people who, my little target demographic, that are all going to be like, oh, I love it. When I see it getting past that group out to other people who maybe don't love it, that to me is a positive thing.
I was just telling myself that last week. It's a good thing to have
Right.
a variety of reviews, because you are spanning past
Right.
your fan base, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. That means it's getting out there to other people, and that is important to me. So
Yes. In essence, what you're doing is expanding your fan base.
right. And not everyone's going to like it then, because you're getting past your target demographic.
Yes.
But they still read it.
Yes,
So-
right. Yes, right. And I also think the feedback is helpful too.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes you can learn more from a negative review than from a positive one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about October and November of 2021. So typically that's the time when you start to plan your next book.
Right.
So what's the plan for you right now?
Right. So, and I did do that because I have a book coming out next year, but that book had to be turned in September because I have to be a year ahead of where the publisher is at. So that book, is already finished, turned in, good to go. So in October, I did start outlining a new story and started, I start a new notebook for every book so that they each have their own notebook. And so then whatever one I'm working on, then that's the notebook I'll get out. So I started a new notebook, started my brainstorming, my outlining, and then I started drafting just last week, actually.
Okay, so it started for you.
Yep.
And when do you expect that your fourth published book will be ready for your editor?
My goal is to have the draft done by the end of March. I set some word count goals and hope to keep them. But at that point, I'll have to start pitching it. So, because it doesn't have a contract at this point. So again, I'm really just riding on faith that at some point somebody will want the story. And so sometime in kind of probably late spring is when I'll start sending it to my editor to pitch it.
It sounds like you couldn't not write though.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think I would go crazy if I didn't have that. That's my outlet. And also, like I said, I'm just have a lot of energy, and I'm very active. And so I would go crazy here at home with my kids, not because of my kids, but because of my own problems, my own brain. I would go crazy with myself. Let's put it
Yes,
that way. Because my
right.
kids are actually really great. And one of them is homeschooled. So he's here. And then the baby's always here, obviously. So two of the older kids then go to school. So they're all great, but I would go crazy with my own mind if I didn't have
Yes.
writing.
Yes. Yeah, because it's such a helpful release. And I also think it's a helpful way to sort through situations or
Mhm.
relationships or things that have happened.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, what did a flicker of light help you sort through?
Right. I had a lot of experience with people with dementia before my grandma was diagnosed with dementia because I had spent about 10 years in care homes volunteering. I would do sing-alongs and I would do like games or help them write letters. And I would do a lot of, they really loved getting their nails painted. So
Mhm.
I would bring a nail kit and I would paint their nails. So I had spent a lot of time with them. And usually in a care home, you're with people who are at the end stages of the disease. So then my grandma then started the beginning stages of the disease, right? So I knew it was hard for me because as she's entering the beginning stages, I had been spending all this time with people in the end stages. So I knew where this was headed, right? I knew very clearly the road that we were on. Um, so that was hard because we had been very close. Like I said, she and I were kind of the storytellers and we had that connection and we were really close. And so even though at the beginning, she still knew me at that point and things like that. But like I said, I knew where it was headed and that was hard to accept. So in a flicker of light, the granddaughter, she goes through that same thing, having to accept that her grandma is not the person that she was before and that was okay, that she was still her grandma, even though she had changed.
Okay, I love that. I love that. There's something too about taking a real story and using fiction as a way to express it more freely.
Right. So that you're not tied to the actual story, which
Yeah,
is really difficult. Then you're limited. If you tell it in a fictional way, you can do whatever you feel needs to be done with it rather than being limited.
And there is a concern too, if you write a nonfiction book about your personal caregiving experience, you have to be so aware of others who are part of that story, who
Right.
are who are siblings, your
Right.
carrie.
And who experienced it differently than you did.
Yes, that's one of the
Yeah.
conversations we've had with authors who have written nonfiction, is really
Mhm.
thinking about how do you ensure that this is your story and that others understand it's just your
Just
perspective of
yours.
it.
Yeah. And that you're
Right.
not trying to tell their story, because they'll say, that's not how, that's not what I thought, or that's not how I experienced this. It's like, I know, because I'm not telling your story, I'm telling my own. And that, so I agree, that would be very difficult.
So then the fiction then allowed you to really actually get closer to your story
Right.
in order to tell a story that you felt honored the relationship between you and your grandmother.
Right. Yes.
Okay. All right. So, Katie, your two books are A Flicker of Light and The Sewing Season. Tell us what your website address is so our listeners and viewers can be in touch.
KatiePowner.com. So it's nice and easy. KatiePowner.com. And then from there, you can get links to the books, or links to all my socials, or links to, like, if you have a book club, there's book club resources on there, all those kinds of things. So once you get to KatiePowner.com, everything else you need is there.
Okay, excellent. Katie, thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for having me.